want you to imagine that someone in the Atlanta area has decided to throw a really nice luncheon. One where all of the who's who of all this area, actually the whole country, maybe the whole world, were going to be there, and you didn't get invited. But someone who had been invited couldn't make it, and so they contacted someone who knew that you would be really interested in going to this party, to this luncheon. And so they extended the opportunity to you and said, hey, would you be interested? And so you just leap on that opportunity. You're excited about it. Now, what I want you to do is, in thinking about this possibility, I want you to think about someone in this world who's still alive, who you really admire. Someone that would be maybe in that echelon of being famous, an authority in a particular field. And that person that you would really like, that you would like to connect with, that you would like to sit at a table with, they're going to be there. And you might even have that opportunity to sit at that table. So take that second right now and try to get that person in your brain. Because now you walk into the banquet hall and you see the tables arranged. And so you start to scan, because you know that each of these celebrities, each of these high-profile people is going to kind of have their own table. And for the rest of the guests, it's up to you just kind of to find your way to the person who you're going to get to sit with, and that you can sit at their feet, that you can hear the words of wisdom that they have to share in your particular field or the area that you're interested in. And so you scan the room, and then you see it. Of course, it's the furthest table away from you, but you see that person, and they're standing there, and they're talking to someone, and then they sit down, and somebody else sits down at the table with them. And so you think, I've got to hurry up because I don't want to, this is my opportunity. I don't want to lose my opportunity. And so you start to make your way towards that table. And when you start to make your way towards that table, somebody grabs your arm and stops you. So you turn around, frustrated, right, upset. And this person says, you probably shouldn't do that. Do what? Like, what are you talking about? I'm trying to, no, that's kind of haughty of you. Like, just for you to think, someone that you could just kind of march in and go and sit next to that person, that you could go up to that table and be there. Like, really, there's other tables over here where there's no celebrity speaker, there's no authority figure. And it's better for you if you would just sit here. And then if there's space left at that table, let them call you up. Because what you don't want to have happen is that you rush to that table and you sit down, and then they have to say, I'm sorry, that seat's been reserved. You've got to go. So you're kind of mulling this over when the host of the banquet starts to walk by. And they're making their way up, and as they make their way up, everybody's now scurrying to their seats because they're going to this podium that's in the front. And the same person that stopped you grabs them and says, you know what? You shouldn't even have thrown a party like this. You did this so that you could feel important about yourself. You did this kind of with this idea that you're blessing all of these people, but you really did it so you would be blessed, so that you could stand up in front of everybody and have all of these important people knowing that they really look up to you and that you're the one who brought them all together. You know what? You're going to get your blessing from throwing this party, from doing this luncheon. You'll get it. You'll get your reward. But next time you throw a banquet, you should invite the poor. If you really want to be blessed, invite the blind and the lame, the people that can't walk, the people who never would have been able to ever had a chance to sit with these guys. The underprivileged. That's who you should invite. So things have gotten really awkward, right? And this, if you are sitting in this and you're in this setting and you're like, wow, all right, he talked to me. I'm a nobody in this room. But wow, he just called out the host. And so somebody who hears him say that to the host says, well, someday when this life is all over, then there'll be a banquet and we'll all be sitting at that banquet. And won't that be nice? And so in Luke 14, Jesus turns to that person and he starts to tell them a parable. Now, I don't know why they say this to Jesus. It could be a couple of things, but this is the exact words. It says, when one of those at the table with him heard this, he said to Jesus, "Blessed is the one who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God." And so I've one thought is that this guy is saying this to say, you kind of cut through that awkwardness, right? The silence. Jesus makes a comment to the host of the party, and everybody's feeling weird about it. So it's like that one person that's bold enough and brave enough to just speak up. Oh, well, won't it be great when we're all at that banquet? Or it's kind of a response to what Jesus has said, when Jesus has said to the host, "But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." And so then the person says, "Blessed is the one who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God." That could be an underhanded way of saying, we don't really want to eat with those people. Like, we don't really want to eat in this lifetime with those people. Like, they can have their own banquets and get together on their own time. And someday, if we're all faithful to God, we'll all be together in a different world and in a different way. So Jesus goes on to say this. A certain man, this is verse 16 of chapter 14 in the Gospel of Luke. A certain man was preparing a banquet and invited many guests. At the time of the banquet, he sent a servant to tell those who had been invited, "Come, for everything is now ready." But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said, "I have just bought a field and I must go see it. Please excuse me." Another said, "I've just bought 5 yoke of oxen and I'm on my way to try them out. Please excuse me." Still another, "I just got married. I can't come." The servant came back and reported this to the master. And then the owner of the house became angry, and he ordered his servant, "Go out into the streets and alleys of the town and bring in the poor and the crippled, the blind and the lame." "Sir," the servant said, "what you ordered has been done, but there's still room." So the master told his servant, "Go out to the roads and the country lanes and compel them to come in, so that my house will be full. I tell you, not one of those who are invited will get a taste of my banquet." So we have been talking about Back on Track. We've been looking through the letter, the first letter to the Corinthians that we have. And in that, we have learned some about this Corinthian church, that they had a lot of issues, and they were, by definition, they were off track, right? They were caught up in a lot of different things. But what we learned was in this letter that the Apostle Paul writes to them, in trying to correct them, he does address those individual issues, but he also addresses things that kind of undergird it, the foundational things, which happen to be just that they needed to be glorifying God, and they needed to reorient their lives so that everything they did was about helping other people get saved. Every part of their life would be about helping other people get closer to Jesus. And so in that vein of thinking, we saw last week that one of the issues they had was that they may have actually been pretty good at going into the world to make disciples, but because of their immaturity and their worldliness, then they were having some issues with that. They were focusing on the wrong things. They were not glorifying God when they were trying to share the gospel. They were trying to find ways to glorify themselves. They wanted to impress people. And so in chapter 1 of 1 Corinthians, we see that gets addressed. And in that, we see another side of that coin. And so if we look at verse 26 through 29, it says this: "Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are, and so that no one may boast before him." So in this situation, we see that they were focused on, the Jews were looking for a sign and the Greeks were looking for wisdom. And so last week we saw that the Corinthians were chasing after things so that they could look impressive in front of those groups. But here, when Paul says this, when he says, remember who you were when you were called. Not many were wise, not many were influential, not many were of noble birth. It kind of hints at the Corinthians weren't just chasing after Jews and Greeks, because, that's just an easy way to divide all of who lived around them, right? So it wasn't just categorically that who they were going after, but specifically, they wanted to have the signs and the wonders and all the wisdom because they were going after certain kinds of Jews and Greeks. Who they really wanted to impress were those who were wise, who were influential, who were wealthy, who had noble birth. And that's what Paul is calling them out on. It's not just about getting caught up in having a fancy message, but it's also getting caught up in having a fancy audience. And the ironic thing is that Paul can kind of hint at is that if he had had that same kind of mentality when he came to Corinth, he says, remember who you were when you were called. Because when I came here, if I was going after the fancy audience with a fancy message, you and I would have never even met. Because not many of you have that background. And so we have to remember who we are. Remember who you were. In Galatians Chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, this is kind of talks about Paul's origin story a little bit. And at the end of it, he says this, James, Cephas, and John, those esteemed as pillars, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship when they recognized the grace given to me. They agreed that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. Verse 10 says this, all they asked was that we would continue to remember the poor, the very thing I had been eager to do all along. So when Paul came to Corinth, what was his mindset? Was he saying, I'm going to go to the rich and the powerful? No, he wanted to remember the poor. And so most likely the earliest hearers of the gospel in Corinth, the people that he's now writing this letter to, that's exactly who they were. So what do we do? How do we respond? It's kind of a natural thing, and we all relate to it. I'm not going to read through it, but if you're familiar with the text, James Chapter 2 is another text, verses 1 through 9, where another people are kind of being reprimanded for the same kinds of thing. And in that case, James is saying, look, you've got two people come into your presence, into your assembly, into your gathering, and one is rich and well-dressed, and you give that person a good place to sit, a place of prominence. But the poor person, you just push to the side. Well, maybe there's a seat in the back. And this is a struggle for us because it's natural. Anybody like cars? Any car people out there? Yeah. Okay. I like cars. I'm not like a huge car enthusiast, but I'm driving down the road, I like cars, right? My son, he's 11, he likes cars. When we drive down the road, you know what we don't say? He doesn't say, Dad, look at that Honda Accord over there, right? Unless it's, tricked out or something like that, right? Oh, Robert, check out the Ford Taurus. Yeah, it's coming down, right? We do not have those conversations when we're driving together, but we do say, whoa, do you see that Lamborghini? Because that's impressive. That's different. And there's never a time in our world where those things don't stand out. As people, we're drawn to them. And it's the same thing for those who are wealthy and influential. If somebody who is wealthy and influential came and visited us here this morning, they would have no lack of conversation partner. And it's not necessarily a fault of ours. It's how we are, right? If you notice they weren't talking to anybody, somebody would fill in. Although at the same time, someone who was just kind of dressed in plain clothes and didn't have a recognizable face, that person could stand out there and go unrecognized. So the point, when the New Testament talks about remembering the poor, it's not saying, forget about the rich. They don't need Jesus. That's not the call. The call is, we know that you're never going to forget about the rich, the wealthy, the influential. That person is always going to have a chance. That person is always going to have somebody that's going to go and talk to them and be their friend. So all we ask is that when you go out, don't forget the poor, because that's what we do. Early on in ministry, I got called to a couple's house. So I went to their house, and we're talking, and they're frustrated. Now, they came to the church about the same time that I came to the church, and so they wanted me to help them get involved a little bit more, but not involved like with ministry stuff, involved in people's lives. They wanted help making friends. So this was a little bit of a surprise to me, because in my view, they were a pretty good couple. They were fairly social. And I thought they had been making those connections. But they said, Rob, people aren't inviting us over to dinner. People aren't having us over to their houses. People aren't asking us to go out and do things with them. People aren't calling us on our phones to talk. And again, it was a little confusing to me, because I'd known of some of the social interactions that they had. I had even had them over for dinner. I guess I didn't count. But that was the case. So, well, who is it that you want? Like, who is it that you're looking for this kind of interaction? And so they started to name off 4 or 5 or 6 couples in the church. And you know who they were? The couples that had the highest stake, the easiest way to claim being of noble birth, of having some kind of wealth, of some kind of influence. They were saying to me, Rob, these people are not calling us, and so we don't feel like we fit in. And so one thing that we need to do is we need to know where we fit in. Because what I did with that couple is then I said, well, what about these people, or this lady, or this guy? Because you sit from where you sit and you look up and you say, I want these people to include me, but there are a dozen more. For every one person that you want to call you, there's 6 people that are looking up to you. And they're saying, I wonder why they don't call me. I wonder why they don't have me over to their house. I wonder why they don't include me in their social life. And so we need to understand that for most of us, that's where we live. We live in the middle. We're never going to forget the haves, but we'll have a tendency to overlook the have-nots. And so that's the call this morning. That's the call, is to not overlook those people. I think that was an amen I got. In 1 Corinthians, Paul says, I'm just going to read the same verse that I've read already, but not many of you were wise. Think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. So why did God call them? So that's, as we take the message to them and we kind of bring it into our lives, if Paul was calling them to get back on track, and the primary way to get back on track was making disciples in a way that would be glorifying to God and prioritizing those things in their life, then why were they called? It wasn't for their birth, the family they were born into. It wasn't because of the wisdom they had or any kind of knowledge they had. It wasn't because of whatever wealth they had. And so you think about that for you. Why did God call you? And then strip away all those possible human reasons. God didn't call you because of what family you were born into. He didn't call you because of the potential you have. He didn't call you because you're so smart and clever. He didn't call you because you're good looking. He didn't call you because you're athletic. And yet you're called. And you answered the call. And you came to the banquet. And so we remember who we are so we don't forget what our purpose is. So we don't get caught up in trying to impress people that we don't need to be trying to impress. And lastly, in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, if the first takeaway is, man, let's just take some time and remember who we are. The second thing I want us to think about is who they are. Because we can, well, I'll just read this. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 16. So from now on, we regard no one from a worldly point of view. Though we once regarded Christ in this way, we do so no longer. So even the Apostle Paul used to look at the world in a very worldly way, in a very judgmental way. And we can see this from the things that we also learn in the New Testament and the Gospel, right? There's that story in John chapter 9 with the man who was born blind. And the question is, who sinned so that this man was born blind? Right? Who did something wrong so that this terrible thing happened to this person? That's what they thought back then. That was an association that they made. His parents must have sinned. And the reason that their son was born blind, it was because they did something wrong, and this was God's way of punishing that. Or maybe somehow this child sinned, or somebody else sinned. Maybe it was a grandparent or an uncle, and for some reason this punishment came down. That is how Paul used to look at things. Right? That's a worldly way of looking at things. Now, we can see that, we can read that about somebody being born blind and think, that's absurd. And yet, the next time that you get sick, or you've got a stomach ache, excuse my crudeness, you're sitting on the toilet, and you're like, God, what did I do to deserve this? Right? Have you've been there, right? You have been there. And you associate your pain and what you're going through with possible wrongdoing. And we put that on other people. And so when we see somebody going through something in their life, when we see someone down in the dumps, when we see someone who's poor, there is a natural reaction to say, well, they probably did something to deserve that. Now, it might not be overt, it might not be like way out there, it might be subconscious. But we still today, that is not a primitive old way of thinking. It's still, well, maybe it is primitive, but it's still in our brains today. And so we need to remember who we were when we were called, and we need to remember who they are, and no longer look at them from a worldly point of view. Because whatever those people are, I guarantee you, we all have the people in our lives who have made many excuses. And what God is saying, what God is telling us this morning is, I want this room to be full. Bring them in. Go wherever you need to go to. Talk to whoever you need to talk to. And bring them into my banquet. Get them here. That is what I want. That is why I did all of this. That's why I've put on this whole thing, is to have a full banquet. And so go get them. And so when we go get them, they would have judged the lame and the blind as being unfit to come into that presence. So we need to not do that. We need to remember who they are and no longer look at them from a worldly point of view, but look at them from the point of view of a new creation. Because if you and I have been recreated, we know what we once were, and we know what their potential is. That they were created in the image of God. That they are a soul who needs to be reconciled to Jesus. And so we take that and we see the world with new eyes. We're going to stand now. We're going to sing a song where we beg God, where it's a plea to God to change us, to say, in my life, Lord, be glorified. So I want to challenge you, as you sing this song, think about those words and think of how it applies to the people in your life who you might be trying to reach with the gospel.